After defining and recruiting the right interview audience, the next step is to structure and conduct user interviews in a way that ensures you'll get valuable information from each conversation. An effective user interview has three key objectives. The first is to refine your hypotheses about the user. This means clarifying who they are, what their profile attributes are, their motivations, and their relationship to the product. The second objective is to refine your hypotheses about the user problem. You want to understand the problem in their own words, what it is and why it happens, how severe it is, and what alternatives or workarounds they currently use to solve it. The third objective is to explore whether other problems may be more valuable to solve. By speaking with users, you may uncover new and more painful problems that can be addressed through this feature opportunity. The first two objectives map to the user profile and user problem hypotheses from the manager briefing. You need to determine if these hypotheses were correct and refine them based on the new information you obtain. The final objective is about exploring beyond the initial hypotheses to determine if there are other more valuable areas to work on. On that note, it's important to keep in mind that user interviews are not about exploring potential solutions. You only want to learn about the problem from the user's perspective. If you start to explore solutions at this point, you may be inserting your own biases into the interview and guiding the user to the answer you want. In addition, users aren't equipped to come up with innovative solutions to their own problems because they only have the perspective of what already exists. It's your job to translate their perspectives into insights that guide your solutions. But even with this guiding principle in mind, there are three common pitfalls new PMs run the risk of falling into during interviews. The first is not spending enough time warming the user up and gathering foundational information about them. PMs then miss the opportunity to understand the user's view of who they are and how they use the product, which leads them to make assumptions about what users care about. Anand shares, I've seen lots of user interviews go sideways because they're an awkward environment for users. When PMs don't start with warm-up questions and comments, they get off to an awkward start and yield lower quality insights. The second pitfall is jumping straight to leading questions that relate to the user problem hypotheses. Doing so can push users toward the PM's desired answer instead of giving them space to respond in their own words. For example, suppose you're a PM at IKEA and you're exploring why so few users purchase on the mobile app compared to the web app. You hypothesize that there's missing functionality, such as not being able to save their payment information. If you're not careful, you might ask leading questions in this area. However, the real problem might be that users can't save items in their cart to buy later. If you start with leading questions around the payment process, you might never discover the real user problem. The final pitfall is being so focused on asking pre-written questions that you miss out on opportunities to follow up on new information. Often the problem you believe is most important turns out not to be the most pressing for the user. But when you spend the whole call trying to follow a script to validate every assumption, you miss out on identifying other valuable problems. Even experienced PMs can struggle with conducting interviews well. So in this lesson, we'll introduce a framework for effective user interviews, the Interview Trail Guide. You can think about interviews as a hike up a mountain that you and your interviewees take together. Treating interviews as a shared journey means that although you hold the map and it's up to you to guide the user to the peak safely and efficiently, there's also room for exploring side trails and other points of interest along the way. Organizing your interview with a trail guide helps you avoid falling into the common traps mentioned previously. It ensures that you spend time warming up the user and getting foundational information on who they are. It stops you from inserting your biases and leading users to the answer you're looking for instead of what they really think. And it gives you the flexibility to explore other insights instead of simply following your script to the letter. The Interview Trail Guide breaks the interview down into 3 phases. First is the warm-up. It begins by establishing rapport. This helps you build a relationship with the participant and fosters trust ahead of the journey. Second is the build phase, where you build up to the problem hypothesis. This means setting the context and boundaries of the problem you want to explore without asking leading questions, so the user can provide their perspective before you dive into the problem hypotheses more fully. The idea here is to guide the interviewee up a gentle incline, rather than scrambling up a cliff and leaving them behind. Next is the peak, where you can finally ask those specific questions about the problem, or peak questions. This is the main objective of your interview, to deeply explore the user's experience of the problem. But it's very difficult to get there without taking the time to warm up and set boundaries. In this lesson, we'll walk through how to structure the interview trail guide to learn about our user profile and problems. You can follow along in the Conducting Interviews tab in the Refine User Value template. We'll also practice building an interview guide for the Gusto onboarding feature opportunity. Let's begin with the warm-up phase. Establishing rapport typically lasts the first 5 to 10 minutes of the 45-minute conversation. During this time, you'll introduce yourselves and break the ice. Think of this as the first steps of the hiking trail, where you're warming up for the climb ahead. You want to loosen up the interviewee and get any housekeeping out of the way before beginning the climb. Establishing rapport ensures that you understand who the user is before jumping in to gather information about the problem. Here are a few ways to open up the conversation. First, make space for introductions to you, your team, and the user. If you have a note-taker or observer in the room with you, clarify everyone's role for the user. Quickly introduce the research you're doing and why you want to speak with them. Ask permission to record the conversation, but make it very clear that this will be for research purposes only. Set the expectation that there are no right or wrong answers. You want them to be comfortable saying what they actually think. Anand says, "I want to make sure they know this isn't a test." I'll often even say, "You can't hurt my feelings, it's not my project. I'm here to pass on information to the project team." Finally, make some small talk. Ask things like, "How's your day going?" or "Any upcoming weekend plans?" After warming up, you'll start building to the peak questions. You can spend about 10 minutes of a 45-minute interview in the build phase, asking users about their experience and underlying attitudes about the product. To build gradually, start broad, and then narrow in on the problem you want to explore. Let's illustrate this by walking through some example questions a company like Grubhub might ask in this phase. First, they might ask about users' general experience in their lives as it pertains to their product's purpose, but not specific to the product. These questions might touch on things like typical weekend routines and eating habits. Then they'd narrow in on the user's experience with food delivery specifically. They might ask questions like, "Why do you order food delivery? How do you normally order food delivery? When do you typically order food delivery? Do you generally have a positive or negative experience ordering food delivery?" Finally, they'd narrow in on the specific problem or company with questions like, "How often do you use Grubhub for food delivery? What's your experience with Grubhub for food delivery?" At this point in your interview, you might find users are either starting to validate your hypotheses or they're bringing up other problems that aren't in your domain. Give them space to share their other problems before you switch gears to your own agenda. Remember, you're trying to understand the user, not validate that you're right. You never want to convince the user of anything. You're trying to understand their reality, even if it's objectively wrong. Giving users this extra space allows you to discover new problems that you may not have thought of, and that might be more important to explore in the next stage of the interview or future interviews. This is why it's important to avoid treating your questions like boxes you need to check. The purpose of a user interview is not for the user to answer all of your questions. It's for their statements to help you answer your questions. When you get an interesting new insight, follow the thread. Ignore the script for a minute and pursue that train of thought to its conclusion. It could lead you to something you hadn't considered and they wouldn't have known to tell you. This is especially important when you transition from the build phase to the peak phase. If a more interesting or pressing problem surfaces during the build, you should prioritize that problem during the peak. Now let's move to the peak of the interview. Most of your insights from the interview tend to be concentrated here, so you should be spending about 25 to 30 minutes of a 45-minute interview on these questions. Generally, in this section of the interview, there are 3 main areas to consider from the user's perspective. Is our hypothesized problem accurate? What alternatives do users leverage to solve the problem today? And how severe is the problem based on the solutions they have available to them currently? Here are some example peak questions from Grubhub. Grubhub might have a hypothesis that delivery time accuracy is a pain point for users. If users have started to mention this during the build, they could follow up with questions like, What is your experience with wait times using Grubhub? Depending on users' answers, Grubhub can determine what alternatives or solutions they use with a question like, when delivery time ranges are too long, what do you do? And finally, Grubhub can try to understand their experience given alternative options. They might ask, how does picking up your food from the restaurant impact your experience of the meal? Let's return to our Gusto example. As a refresher, the Gusto team is investigating an opportunity to improve the new employee onboarding experience for employers. Imagine you're the PM responsible for structuring these user interviews. What questions would you ask in the build phase to understand a user's relevant experiences and behaviors today? What targeted questions would you ask in the peak phase to better understand the user problem? Pause the video and identify a few questions you might use for each of these interview phases. Let's look at the Gusto PM's approach. During the build phase, they might start with, how do you feel about your experience onboarding new employees today? Next, the PM can follow up to ask which tools or systems they use to onboard new employees currently. Finally, they might ask specifically about issues with their onboarding tools today. In the peak phase, Gusto's team can start to dig more into the specific user problem they identified, managing all of the activities necessary to properly onboard a new employee. They might start with, walk me through the steps you take to onboard a new employee. Once the user has given them an overview, they might probe further by asking, what do you do today to keep track of all the different requirements and deadlines necessary for onboarding? And finally, they can gauge severity by asking, how does this problem impact your onboarding experience today? We've now walked through how to structure and conduct interviews. In the next lesson, we'll talk about the last step of the user interview process, debriefing and synthesizing the user value.